Alright, so in this part of the presentation, I'm going to be going through the proponents and opponents of world systems theory. I'm mainly going to be focusing on Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, and just kind of like what that entails, not just for populations, but for international like nations as well. So the big question Gramsci was trying to get at was who has power in this perception of power, and whether that be the elite minority being the most powerful, or if it's the majority of the people, the common folk, they're seen as powerless. So you're just kind of toying around with that idea and seeing, why is that? Why do the top certain percent of people have the most power? His biggest thing that he came up with is it needs to be legitimized, so it needs a sense of legitimacy. The elite could reach that in two ways: through force, which it has traditionally been done in, or through consent, which is kind of more of a 20th century kind of idea with capitalism and things of that nature. So it's just kind of been more institutionalized versus just kind of done through military force. So the elite kind of craft this dominant fundamentalism, or throughout the reading they called it common sense, which is shared by everyone, not just the elite. So it's shared by the common folk as well. And this is really powerful because this dominant fundamentalism is created by the elite for the elite, but then since they're such a small group, they have to convince everyone that it benefits them as well, or it's in their best interest to support that as well, when in fact it only supports that elite group. Now, in order for dominant fundamentalism to be successful, the majority need to give it consent. And that's where the idea of contradictory consciousness comes in, just because the elite is conditioning the common folk to believe that they need this and this and this, while their actions, their work experience, their real life, their reality is contradicting what the elite says that these people need to strive for or to desire. So that kind of comes up with inner conflict, inner turmoil. And I've mentioned dominant fundamentalism or dominant culture several times, but like, what exactly is that? Basically, it's just the whole institution behind protecting what's already there, which already benefits the elite. So they don't want change coming into it, and like, if there is change, they want to be the ones instituting that change. Now, the elite manipulate the people to gain their consent through ways of controlling experiences. So which experiences are seen as good or as really desired versus ones that are suppressed or just kind of ignored. The example that the book gave was, people would, or like the common folk would argue that America is an equal country and everyone starts on an equal level. But then when they would compare themselves to like a successful lawyer or businessman or something like that, they would argue against that. And that's just a throwback to what I mentioned about contradictory consciousness, because they believe one thing, but then they do another. Another kind of key point in this theory is just that the line between dominant and subordinate people is permeable. So they're not two isolated communities, but they're they're really meshing together, and they're connected in this really big, intricate way. Although it's manipulation, but still, at least they're connected. They're not two divided, different societies. They are one society connected and influencing each other. So I've kind of gone over Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, and now I'm just going to kind of hit on some of the counterpoints or the alternative views new forms of hegemony can actually come up from below. And that can happen basically through historical blocks, which are just these groups being formed based off of cultural and economic solidarity. And it's with people who share the same worldview from their experiences, and that can lead to counter hegemony. But that even that is quite difficult. For example, there was this anti-magic kind of ideology in the 17th century in England, and it was kind of started by the common folk, but it got adopted into this developing hegemony. So it got adopted by the elites and just kind of like, at least to me, it just seems like it really lost a lot of that counter hegemonic kind of vibe to it. Since it was adopted, it just kind of like, I mean, I guess you could see it as a success, but I don't really. I just kind of think that no matter what they tried, it was still adopted by the elite, taken and then used to manipulate the common folk. Or another alternative to Gramsci's idea was just this rule through force, and you could see how governments and the elite use this when hegemony breaks. So if one of those counter hegemonic movements is successful, the elite will resort to force to keep their legitimacy, or they'll also resort to it if this hegemony still hasn't formed yet. So the example used in the book was America during the early 20th century with the Industrial Revolution was just ruling through force as people were kind of being introduced to factory life and things of that nature. Another alternative to cultural hegemony is genuine consensus, where people kind of get together and they have fundamental debates, and then people can choose whether they support that conclusion or not based off of their own personal self-interest. This is a big kind of deviation away from dominant fundamentalism, in the sense that people are finally choosing for themselves what is best for them versus choosing what they are kind of led to believe by the elite and by the dominant culture. They're finally free from that. In the article, they went through this trade-off where it was argued that workers do take these dehumanizing positions in the economic sphere in order to retain autonomy in the private sphere, and it just kind of shows like what things truly matter. Like, is it family or is it where you stand in the world? And John Gaventa actually went out and tried to prove the falsibility of Gramsci's theory, and that would kind of give it some more strength. But it's really hard to kind of prove that, especially when you're dealing with real human experiences, just because they're so much more complex. And a lot of what he was trying to accomplish was things that haven't happened. So it's really hard to study and analyze things that didn't happen. For example, he focused on some Appalachian miners, where he couldn't prove that they would have acted differently if this dominant this dominant culture wasn't acting on them. Like there was no way to prove that, and there is no way. So it was really hard to falsify that. After spending some time looking into Gramsci's theory as well as some of his critics, I can't help to notice, but a lot of his theory is still seen in the international kind of globalized world that we live in today. Gramsci talked about this link between all three of these elements working together, which is a lot of what we see in globalized, like the international globalized culture, where not only are like developing nations adopting economic practices of, let's say, like the US, they're also taking cultural and political influences from the US as well. So it doesn't come as an isolated thing, it comes as a package deal. And that's just kind of what we've been seeing through the international community. It's like a bigger issue than I originally thought. So it was really interesting being able to apply that to real life in this kind of theory. Like when I read it at first, it was just really kind of abstract and kind of difficult to get through. But once I started seeing the connections in real life, it was just kind of I could see how it connected and how it was still relevant. So I hope hopefully this video made that a little bit clearer as well.